Every single item on today's list was morally repugnant and would later be condemned worldwide. There were gross violations of human dignity carried out with no consent, no oversight, and no regard for the people forced into them. They would be unthinkable today. Today's list is not meant to give you gore or to excuse what was done, but I will talk about how they changed policy, reshaped medical ethics, and left behind knowledge that still drives modern science. However, before we get started, please don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, ring that notification bell. It really helps us keep lists like this coming. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 human experiments too disturbing to ignore, and what we learned because of them. 25. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. You should know that before the unethical research done during Tuskegee became public in 1972, questionable ethics in medicine weren't unusual. That's why this list exists. But this specific study became a turning point in the US because it happened in peacetime under federal authority against its own citizens. Now, if you don't know anything about it, the study ran from 1932 to 1972 and followed 399 African American men with syphilis, along with 201 without. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, but no actual treatment was ever given, not even after penicillin became the proven cure. Sadly, though, medical science did gain data on the final stages of untreated syphilis, including the progression of neurosyphilis, cardiovascular damage, and how congenital syphilis passed from mother to child. More importantly, it demanded reform and gave us the 1979 Belmont Report, along with federal laws that made informed consent and ethical oversight non-negotiable. 24. The Nazi Hypothermia Experiments. The way doctors treat hypothermia today, placing victims in warm water to bring their core temperature back up fast, was proven at Dachau, and not in any way you'd want to imagine. That knowledge came from men being frozen alive in the name of science. In 1942, SS physician Sigmund Rascher set out to help the German Air Force. About 200 camp prisoners were shoved into low-pressure chambers to mimic extreme altitude. They convulsed, passed out, and many never came out alive. Others were stripped and left in the snow or dropped into ice water for hours. After the war ended, survivors told their stories in court at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, which gave the world the Nuremberg Code, the first real rulebook on how humans can be used in medical research. 23. The Nazi Wound Experiments. I have to reiterate that nothing on today's list is condoned. In fact, it horrifies me. The Nazis carried out a massive amount of human experimentation, and at Ravensbrück camp, one focus was the treatment of wounds. Doctors deliberately injured prisoners to test whether sulfonamides, the first widely used antibiotics, could stop dangerous infections like gangrene. At the time, some scientists argued that the effectiveness of sulfa drugs had already been proven in animal studies and earlier clinical work. Others said it was still an open question, especially in cases of severe wound contamination. The Nazis' inhumane efforts confirmed that sulfonamides had value in treating battlefield infections, but also showed their limits when wounds were badly contaminated. 22. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Study. The difference between hepatitis A and B wasn't worked out in some pristine lab. It came from children in a state-run school being deliberately infected. Researchers at Willowbrook in New York told parents their kids couldn't enroll unless they signed consent papers. The real deal was that over 700 kids were dosed with the virus to watch how it spread. Almost every child got sick, some more than once. The research did separate hepatitis into type A and B, which later led to vaccines and treatments still in use today, but that's not what sticks in people's memory. It's that the knowledge only exists because disabled kids were expected to carry it. 21. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's take a break from the physical experiments for a moment to those of the mind. In 1971, researchers at Stanford built a fake prison in the basement of their psychology department and filled it with college students role-playing as either guards or prisoners. The study was meant to last 2 weeks, but it collapsed after only 6 days because the transformation was just too extreme. The guards turned sadistic almost overnight. Prisoners who had been normal and healthy just a week before broke down, obeyed degrading orders, and showed severe stress reactions. The experiment shocked both the public and the profession. It proved that people's behavior isn't only about who they are inside, but also about the environment they're put into, a concept known as situational power. That finding shaped decades of psychology, became a staple in textbooks, and even influenced things like prison policy and military training. 20. Unit 731. Let's just get this one out of the way, shall we? A lot has been written and said about the experiments the Japanese carried out in the infamous Unit 731. Thousands of prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians and POWs, were infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax, or subjected to frostbite and weapons testing. Only a few people left Unit 731 alive. As disturbing as it is, some of the findings made their way into medicine. Researchers confirmed how plague spreads, how cholera destroys the body, and even how frostbite could be reversed. After the war, the Japanese traded parts of their research with the US military in exchange for immunity, which is probably the cruelest legacy of Unit 731, that people got away with it, and that it shaped the way the world looks at biological warfare. 19. The Guatemala STD Experiments. What does it take for a government to apologize 60 years later? Well, in this case, it was more than 1,300 Guatemalans infected with sexually transmitted diseases by US and Guatemalan doctors. Their goal was to study how syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroids spread, and whether penicillin could prevent them. The answer was yes. The files were buried and they stayed hidden until 2010, when a historian uncovered them and forced the US to issue a formal apology. President Barack Obama did issue an apology in 2010, and a federal commission condemned the experiments as morally wrong. But the survivors and their families have never been compensated, and almost nothing has been done to repair the harm. 18. The Nazi Seawater Experiment. Nothing useful came out of the Nazi seawater experiments. That is the plain truth. In 1944, Dr. Hans Eppinger at Dachau set out to find a way for stranded sailors to survive by drinking salt water. About 90 Romani prisoners were locked in the study. Some were dosed with seawater mixed with a chemical that was supposed to strip out the salt. Others were given plain seawater, and none of them were allowed to have real drinking water. The outcome was horrific. The prisoners tried to find moisture anywhere they could, and their bodies eventually failed due to dehydration and kidney damage. The experiment confirmed the obvious. Seawater can't replace fresh water. And what stood for desalination treatments at the time couldn't fix that. 17. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is usually remembered as the CIA's mind control scandal, but it also left behind a lot of data that medicine has been forced to reclaim. Between 1953 and 1973, the agency ran more than 100 sub-projects testing LSD and other psychoactive drugs. Patients, prisoners, even unsuspecting civilians were dosed without their knowledge. The results were messy. Some people suffered psychotic breaks, others reported intense insight, but the one clear pattern that emerged was that psychedelics had lasting effects on the mind. That raw, unethical groundwork became the seed for today's legitimate research. Today's modern trials, run with full consent, now show that psilocybin and MDMA can help people with severe depression, PTSD, and even end-of-life anxiety. In fact, psilocybin is now in late-stage FDA trials as a treatment for major depression, and MDMA therapy for PTSD has been so effective, it may soon be approved for clinical use. 16. The Marshall Islands Radiation Study. When Merrill Eisenbud, Chief of Health and Safety for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, called the Marshallese more like us than the mice, he wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. After the Castle Bravo test in 1954, fallout blanketed Rongelap and nearby islands. Hundreds of people got radiation burns, lost hair, vomited, and begged for evacuation. Days later, instead of moving them to safety, the U.S. launched Project 41. For decades, American doctors tracked their bodies. Teeth pulled to measure radiation, thyroid glands sliced, cancers logged, pregnancies monitored. The science was groundbreaking. It proved radioactive iodine attacks the thyroid, and that discovery still drives how potassium iodide pills are stockpiled after nuclear accidents today. But the Marshall Islands still live with the fallout. In the northern atolls, up to 55% of cancers among exposed populations are linked to the tests. The U.S. set up a compensation fund under the 1986 Compact, but the tribunal ran dry long before the claims did, leaving survivors to carry most of the burden themselves. 15. The Milgram Obedience Experiment. In the 60s, one Yale scientist decided to test how far people were willing to go in order to follow authority. Now, the difference between Stanley Milgram's test versus, say, the Stanford prison experiment was that Milgram's setup zoomed in on obedience. Could a man in a lab coat push ordinary people into doing something they believed was cruel? For the study, the learners, or people getting shocked, were actors, pretending to experience pain. And the shockers, or teachers if you will, were ordered to deliver shocks on command, escalating step by step until many believed they were inflicting real torture. The experiment showed that people would follow orders even when they believed they were inflicting serious harm on someone else. The shockers sweated, trembled, stammered, their heart rate spiked, and some even had seizures from the strain. That discovery, that following harmful orders could cause biological stress reactions, fed directly into trauma science. Psychologists began linking moral conflict to long-term harm, a concept now called moral injury, and became a foundation for later PTSD research in soldiers, police, and first responders. 14. The Monster Study on Stuttering. Kids are easy to hurt. Everyone knows that. And when those kids don't have parents to protect them, the damage cuts even deeper. In 1939, speech pathologist Wendell Johnson and his student Mary Tudor carried out what is now called the Monster Study at an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa. They picked 22 kids for their experiment, then told half of the fluent ones that they were already showing signs of stuttering and scolded them for every supposed slip. The rest got encouragement and praise. The fallout was sadly predictable. Some of the normal speakers grew anxious, stopped talking as much, and carried that fear of speaking into their adult lives. What the researchers proved is something speech therapy still builds on today. Negative reinforcement makes speech problems worse, while positive feedback and patience improve fluency. 13. Little Albert. Fear doesn't always come from danger. Sometimes it's taught. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins, John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to prove it. They worked with a 9-month-old boy nicknamed Little Albert, who at first had no fear of furry animals. He reached for a white rat like any baby would. But when Watson struck a steel bar behind his head every time he touched it, Albert quickly learned to associate the rat with terror. Before long, it wasn't just rats. Rabbits, dogs, and even Santa Claus masks set off the same panicked reaction. The worst part is that Albert was never deconditioned. He left the hospital still afraid, something that would be unthinkable today. But the study opened a door we still walk through in psychology. It showed that fears and phobias could be learned, and that discovery became the basis of modern exposure therapy. 12. The Holmesburg Prison Experiments. If you were locked up in Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison in the 50s or 60s, your skin was up for sale. Dermatologist Albert Kligman famously called it acres of skin, and he wasted no time cashing in. Prisoners would line up to have everything from deodorant and face cream to radioactive isotopes and even dioxin smeared, patched, or injected into them, all for nothing more than a few dollars of pocket money. The price was steep. Some men were left with rashes and burns, while about 75 inmates in the 1965 dioxin trial developed severe acne-like lesions that scarred them for life. Discoveries, however, changed medicine. Kligman's vitamin A tests in Holmesburg paved the way for retin A, which is still a go-to treatment for acne, psoriasis, and skin aging. Toxicologists also built modern safety thresholds for chemical exposure off Holmesburg data. What did not survive was the method. By the 70s, public outrage resulted in an end to most prisoner testing in the US, and Holmesburg became the case study for why consent and dignity matter. 11. The Plutonium Experiments. During the Manhattan Project, plutonium was the new wonder weapon, but nobody really knew what it did inside the human body. So, between 1945 and 1947, doctors in Rochester, Chicago, San Francisco, and Oak Ridge quietly injected 18 patients with the stuff. Some were terminally ill. Others were simply told they were getting a promising new treatment. After the injection, scientists tracked every sample they could get, urine, blood, and even bone tissue, to see how plutonium moved and left the body. Today, modern nuclear medicine still leans on that formula, now known as the Langham model. It tells scientists how to calculate the amount of plutonium in a body based on what leaves in urine or blood. The darker side of the testing stayed suppressed until the 90s, when the experiments were exposed and President Bill Clinton had to issue a formal apology. 10. The Edgewood Arsenal Chemical Experiments. Every US soldier today carries a nerve agent antidote kit that was born from the human testing the government did at Edgewood Arsenal. From 1955 to 1975, more than 6,000 young recruits walked into what they thought were harmless trials. Nobody told them they'd be breathing mustard gas in sealed chambers, swallowing experimental pills, or riding out LSD trips so intense they couldn't tie their boots. The Army wanted to know what these poisons did and how to stop them. But nobody tracked what happened to the men. In some cases, the nerve pain would last for decades. In others, the paranoia would never go away. It took most of them decades to realize just what they were given. 9. The Soviet Poison Lab. Imagine a poison that killed you in under 20 minutes, left you silent as you went, and fooled the coroner afterward. That's what Stalin's people were cooking up inside their poison lab, the Chimera. For decades, under NKVD chiefs and chemist Grigory Marinovsky, Gulag prisoners would be dosed with toxins slipped into their food or medicine. They tested ricin, digitoxin, curare, and cyanide, and eventually came up with a tasteless compound called C2, tailor-made for assassinations. The bodies never gave away the truth. There was no real medical benefit, but toxicology picked up a few dark lessons about how certain compounds move through the body. The forensic science that can now flag rare poisons owes part of its development to what happened there. When the lab's existence was confirmed years later through defectors and archives, it drove the world to confront how easily science can be twisted for covert killing. 8. The Nazi twin experiments at Auschwitz. Being a twin could be the difference between the gas chamber and the lab at Auschwitz. Around 1,500 pairs, most of them children, were separated from their families and turned over to Joseph Mengele, the camp doctor known as the Angel of Death. Survivors like Eva Moses Kor recalled being measured for hours, injected with unknown substances, and forced through endless procedures. Mengele usually used one twin as a control and the other as his test subject. Of about 3,000 children tested, only about 200 survived. Mengele's work produced no scientific value. It didn't unlock the secret of twin births or genetics. But, ironically, the very model Mengele abused, studying twins to separate nature from nurture, went on to become one of psychology's most powerful tools, once done ethically. Twin studies today have illuminated everything from schizophrenia to eating disorders, even the effects of microgravity on NASA astronauts. 7. J. Marion Sims's Gynecological Experiments. J. Marion Sims is often called the father of modern gynecology, but the title hides how he got there. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims built a backyard hospital in Montgomery, Alabama, where he operated on enslaved black women suffering from vesicovaginal fistula, a childbirth injury that leaves women incontinent. Women, known only as Arachna, Lucy, and Betsy, were subjected to dozens of experimental surgeries. Sims refused to use anesthesia, even though ether was already in practice by 1846, claiming the operations weren't very painful or that black women could endure pain better. Both false, and rooted in racism, by the way. Sims finally perfected a repair technique using silver sutures and left behind working methods and hardware that shaped gynecology for generations. What he didn't leave behind was any record of consent, because there wasn't any. The progress was real, but so too was the exploitation. 6. Chester Southam's cancer cell injections. Modern immunotherapy, drugs that train your body to hunt down cancer, owes a piece of its foundation to a study nobody volunteered for. In 1963, Dr. Chester Southam injected live HeLa cancer cells into 22 chronically ill patients at a Brooklyn hospital. They weren't told the cells were cancerous, only that they were part of a skin test. The idea was to see whether the immune system could fight cancer on its own. In most cases, it did. Tumors sprouted and then shrank away. But some patients developed persistent growths, and one had cells spread locally before removal. The scandal broke when 3 doctors blew the whistle, and Southam was censured. The data, though, confirmed that immune defenses could reject cancer, an insight that still underpins cancer immunotherapy to this day. 5. The Puerto Rico contraceptive trials. By 1960, the birth control pill was hailed as revolutionary. Women could take a daily tablet, skip the fear of pregnancy, and join the workforce on new terms. But before that magic little pill hit US pharmacies, it was tested on women who were never told the whole story. Harvard researchers Gregory Pincus and John Rock ran early trials on psychiatric patients in Massachusetts, doing invasive procedures like endometrial biopsies to confirm ovulation. Then, they exported their work to Puerto Rico, where poverty and lax oversight made recruitment easy. More than 200 women in San Juan housing projects signed up, many eager for contraception. What they got were high-dose pills that caused blood clots, bleeding, nausea, and invasive monthly procedures. The data proved the drug could prevent pregnancy. But when the trials ended, those same women couldn't even afford the pill they'd helped create. 4. The first spinal taps. Today, a lumbar puncture is standard practice. Doctors use it to diagnose meningitis, multiple sclerosis, and even cancers, pulling a sample of spinal fluid with a needle between the vertebrae. It saves lives. But when the procedure was first tested in the US, it was anything but routine. In 1895, Dr. Arthur Howard Wentworth performed one of the first spinal taps on a 2-year-old girl at Boston Children's Hospital. Witnesses said she thrashed in the bed, clawed at her hair, and cried out in pain. Wentworth decided the procedure was safe, so he repeated it on 29 more infants and toddlers without ever telling their parents what he was doing. Wentworth demonstrated that the test worked, but he also showed how quickly medicine can lose its conscience. 3. The unfortunate experiment. Not every item on this list is about what doctors did to people. Dr. Herbert Green at Auckland's National Women's Hospital in New Zealand made it here because of what he didn't do. Starting in 1966, he decided women with carcinoma in situ, the early precancerous lesions on the cervix, might not need treatment. Instead of following standard care, he kept more than 100 women under observation. They thought they were being treated. They weren't. Over the years, at least 30 developed invasive cancer, and many died. The truth broke in 1987 thanks to journalist Sandra Coney, and the Cartwright inquiry that followed tore Green's theory apart. It exposed what the rest of medicine already knew. CIS can and does progress. 2. John Money's gender reassignment experiment. David Reimer's story began with a botched circumcision in Canada. His parents turned to Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins, who convinced them their son could be raised as a girl. At just under 2 years old, David had his testes removed, was renamed Brenda, and was given female hormones. Money presented the case as a success, proof that gender was learned and not innate. But behind the reports, Brenda was miserable. She preferred rough play, hated the dresses she was made to wear, and grew more isolated as the years went by. Money adapted and included therapy sessions, including coercive role play with her twin brother that crossed every ethical line. By 14, Brenda became so severely depressed that her parents finally told her the truth. She chose to live as David again, underwent surgeries to restore a male appearance, and eventually married, though the scars never left. David's life ultimately dismantled Money's theory. His case pushed medicines toward caution with infant sex assignment surgeries and proved that gender identity isn't something a doctor can simply overwrite. 1. The Cincinnati Whole Body Radiation Experiments. If you were poor and sick in Cincinnati in the 60s, you were more likely to end up as a test subject than a patient. Dr. Eugene Sanger's team exposed 88 people, most of them African American cancer patients, to radiation equal to tens of thousands of x-rays. Families thought it was therapy. In reality, it was a Pentagon study on what nuclear war would do to the human body. The effects were horrific. Violent vomiting, bleeding, confusion, and death within weeks. One woman later said her mother went in for cancer care and came out looking like she'd been hit with a bomb. We got a clearer picture of radiation injury, and today's nuclear emergency plans still draw from it. But some of the victims' families still drive past plaques honoring Dr. Sanger at the hospital. And they don't see a pioneer. They see the man who killed their mother. And that's all I have for you today. But before you go, here's your trivia. Which study revealed the difference between hepatitis A and B? Was it A, the Tuskegee Syphilis study, B, Willowbrook study, C, Holmesburg prison experiments, or D, the Guatemala STD experiments? Drop your answers in the comments below. And if you're just getting started, I do have a related video that might just set the bar a bit higher. 25 longest wars that lasted for centuries. If you want to know more about the wars that changed civilizations, well, I think you'll like this one. Just look for the link right here in a minute, not a minute, a couple seconds. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This was not a happy one. See ya.